the newsagents.
Forgive me, Prime Minister, you've decided to repay £6,000 worth of gifts. Why now? Why those gifts and not all of them? Have you decided it was wrong to take them, or did you come under pressure?
Look, we came in as a government of change. We are now going to bring forward principles for donations because until now, politicians have used their best individual judgment on a case-by-case basis. I think we need some principles of general application. So I took the decision that until the principles are in place, it was right for me to make those repayments.
What is a principle? It's not a law, and it's not even a rule. It's something that still sounds very grey in terms of what MPs, what cabinet ministers, what the Prime Minister himself decides he can or cannot accept as a donation.
And how is it possible that we're still talking about his clothes, his glasses, his Taylor Swift tickets and all the rest of it a month on from when this story first came onto our radar screens? Is it a scandal? Is it being mishandled? And why are Labour being so weird about it? Welcome to the newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And the Labour Party, with this whole freebie gate business, are making a kind of little situation so much worse. Every intervention that they make just seems to make it a bigger story, another news cycle, and on it goes, where you kind of think that if they had just grasped this at the beginning, said everything they had to say, and then shut up about it, they would be in a much better place right now.
Look, I think we've discussed on the show before the extent to which we think that at least elements of this story have been exaggerated in terms of how it's covered or taken out of context, or Labour have sort of been punished for basically just doing what has long been the system and which has never really been an issue before. I mean, I think the best example of that, about like kind of the power of narrative with this story, is the picture that has now become like notorious, which is of Keir Starmer and Victoria Starmer at that Taylor Swift concert, right, back in before the election. And at the time, everyone's like, "Oh, isn't that nice? That's wonderful. Isn't he in touch?" All that sort of thing. Whereas now it's being held up as kind of like Exhibit A of a venal system. But I'm guaranteeing you that at no point when that picture came out did any of us really think who paid for that. And insofar as we might have done, I guarantee we probably would have thought that it wasn't him. But that is the power of narrative in politics, and that's where we are. And I have to say, the way that Downing Street has consistently handled this, or mishandled this now, as you say, John, is making it so much worse. I mean, if you think about the current line, right, which I guarantee will not last another week.
Exactly.
They are basically saying that the Prime Minister has paid the money back for gifts received after the election, but not before the election, because there is a material difference between receiving gifts in office and being in opposition. And moreover, there's a material difference between the Prime Minister accepting it and other ministers accepting it. Therefore, the Prime Minister will pay it back, but other ministers don't have to. I mean, what? That is not going to last. And I can't quite believe that no one in number 10 doesn't quite cotton on to the fact that it's not going to last.
I mean, this scandal is now a month old. Amazingly, it broke at the end of August and we are now in October. And at the beginning, we were saying, I think at Labour conference, we were saying, why has it taken those around Starmer so long to shut this down or fess up or be transparent or make the moves? And then just when you think that it's kind of like the Tories week, you know, we thought we'd all come out of there talking about the Tories. If Labour wants to talk about something else, grab back the agenda, they can do that. They're in government. They start talking about this. And as you say, it's the arbitrariness of those red lines that makes it really complicated. Why this 6,000 but not the last 6,000? Why Keir but not the cabinet? I mean, I understand actually that they're publishing the latest register. I think that's coming out today, which is probably why they're thinking, oh, we'll get ahead of this and say we do need a rule change. Pat McFadden said that on the Sunday shows, and we do need to start paying it back. But I think the interesting thing for my mind is that we have very much moved into what I would call a values-based system of politics now. And it's really complicated because at one time it ought to have been enough to say, that's what the rules allow. If you don't like the rules, change the rules. Change political donations, change campaigning. But I think as a result of, the expenses scandal and everything, and probably the winter fuel allowance, in the last few months, everything about politics is now much more honed in a kind of values space, which is very, very hard to define. And that's why you get questions like, oh, it made me feel sick, or I didn't like it, or it didn't pass the smell test, which is a very hard thing to legislate against. And the government is right now trying to decide, well, do we change it all?
Well, I just don't believe that the answer, in and of itself, is a rule change. It just requires the application of common sense, doesn't it? So if you believe that it was okay to accept tickets to Taylor Swift from Universal, it's not a big deal. They're a huge music publishing company, and concerts and all the rest of it. You get tickets to Taylor Swift. It's fine. It's not a big deal. You thought it was fine a few weeks ago. Why do you now think it's egregious? Just some common sense. Either stick with it and tough it out.
I don't think common sense gets you there, because I think
it does. I think there's
I don't know. I mean,
Emily,
are you allowed to take a pair of glasses? Are you allowed to take a ticket but not a pair of glasses? Is your wife allowed to take clothes but not you? Is your deputy prime minister therefore allowed to take clothes but as well as your wife? I don't think that there is a clear sense.
Also, the rules appear to have changed, right?
They're changing right now.
I don't just mean the literal rules in the government. I mean the rules of the game, in the sense that, like, as I was saying before, the best example I can think of is that picture of Keir Starmer at that Taylor Swift concert, and literally nobody at the time goes,
ask questions.
Where's he got those tickets from, by the way? No one even asked the question.
I think
right?
we all knew.
We all knew. That's what I'm saying. We all.
There's no
knew.
way that Keir Starmer went on, Webmaster or Ticketmaster.
So I'm thinking.
But that's why I'm saying, John, I don't think it is like common sense, right? I
agree.
Because what appeared to be common sense in like the end of June or whenever that concert was is not now, and that is because the narrative has been shifted by the media and by the papers in particular and the Conservative Party, who are determined to really run with this story, and that's politics. That's fine. So the rules appear to have shifted. So it's not common sense. So then it's all about, like, how do you respond to it? And that is where the blame comes back squarely again and again at number 10. Because, as I say, to have responded to it initially in that way, if they should have been able to foresee where this was going, therefore, if they were going to make a rule change, do it to begin with. And if they're going to make a rule change now, then you need to make it comprehensive. You need to make it to apply to everybody.
Well, you heard James
and
Cleverly,
shut it down.
right? James Cleverly, we were in the hall where James Cleverly was asked, a sort of reader's question or, member's question, would you accept free gifts? And he said, or would you ban free gifts? And he said, no. I'd be happy to carry on accepting gifts. What I don't like is the hypocrisy. So in that one statement, you've already got the setting of a new kind of hypocrisy, which is, are you just cross with Keir because he was angry with Boris Johnson and the wallpaper, as opposed to cross with Keir because he accepted the glasses and the tickets? Exactly. You've already got Cleverly, who might be, who stands a very good chance of being opposite Keir Starmer at the dispatcher's box,
saying he'd take gifts.
Saying he'd take gifts. So we can't. Clearly they don't want to take the rules.
So the bit about the common sense the argument I was making was, I didn't think there was anything wrong with taking the Taylor Swift tickets. I don't think it is a big deal. I think he should have said, they're a very big music publishing company. They invited us. It's declared. I don't see the big deal. I think taking £32,000 worth of clothes is common sense. You'd say, no, I don't think we can do that at the time when we are doing everything else. And that just looks absurd, because I think...
Or you phrase it in a different way, which is, one is from Universal, or I think he went to the Doncaster races, a gambling or whatever, and the other is from a Labour donor who could have just given you the money into your coffers as a Labour donation, and you could have spent it however you wanted. I mean, that's why the common sense thing doesn't make sense. And I was listening to this commentator this morning say, he started with this truism, which is the voters are never wrong. And I was kind of listening to him and I thought, well, obviously it's true in the sense that the ultimate decision, the vote, lies with voters. But actually, we as voters do get things wrong. We misunderstand things. We think things are against the law when they're just against the rules.
And things are framed in a particular way.
We hear things from one media source which might be contradicted by another media source. And so what you're really talking about here is the response that Keir Starmer, as the Prime Minister, maybe not even as the head of the Labour Party, but as the Prime Minister, is making towards this imagined sort of fury of voters. And maybe it is real, but he's at that stage got to decide whether intrinsically he thinks he has done something wrong and bad and ill-judged, or whether he's just kind of going, oh, people are cross with me, I've got to do this to get back on the front foot. That's a big difference.
The line that the voters are never wrong is a silly line, if you think about it. The reason we have representative democracy is because we do believe that the voters can often be wrong. And if it was that the voters were always right, we would have capital punishment in this country, and it would be reaffirmed after every mass murder or after every terrorist attack that happened. And the reason we don't is because we have a representative democracy where we elect our MPs and they are there to think about it. So the argument that the voters are always right is it's a silly argument to make. I think that, the Labour government, in a very short space of time, has squandered a lot of goodwill when its mission was to rebuild trust, to tell people that life is complicated, there are big decisions that are going to take a while to enact. And I thought that was a real return to grown-up politics from the sort of simple boosterism and populism of Johnson and some of the other stuff that we've seen over the past decade. And I think that to see that goodwill being squandered by also, what you say, Lewis, a pretty crummy Downing Street operation on some of the comms.
That's at the heart
and
of this
honestly,
story.
I am hearing some real chuntering going on about what is happening in communications in Downing Street. Why are they never ahead of a story? Why are they always behind it? And everything they do just seems to make it worse and leads to another news cycle.
They were so prepared because their election campaign was so slick.
Yes.
And yet in government they seem deeply unprepared. And I'm wondering whether it's something as simple as they actually haven't been in power in the sort of new media age.
I think that is a big part of it. And I think probably we all at the Labour Party conference heard, a lot of disquiet about the comms situation in particular in Downing Street. And there's obviously been a huge focus on Sue Gray as Labour Chief of Staff. There's been less focus on the comms side of things, and I think within the Labour Party, in the Parliamentary Labour Party, there is actually more focus on that than there is about Sue Gray, because MPs that's the thing that MPs have to focus on. But I think, Emily, that you're exactly right about the fact that it feels right now that the Labour Party is, taking a water pistol to a knife fight in terms of the comms situation, right? In the sense that, John, you and I were talking about it the other day, about, we don't often have transitions to Labour governments in this country. The last one was in '97, and as a I don't want to say veteran,
veteran is you being generous. Normally, I'm just the old fart in the corner.
The cadaver. As a veteran of that era, I was asking you actually, what was the transition like in a press environment then? And
don't forget, Tony Blair didn't have a mobile phone.
No, well, right? There's that, but also he had, as you were saying, he had Murdoch.
Gordon Brown through fax machines.
But he had Murdoch, he had the Mail.
You remember in '97, Blair had gone a long way to getting the Mail on side. The Telegraph was against him, the Express was against him, but the really big beasts, they had been neutralised. The Times was backing him, the Sun was backing him, the Mail was
and there wasn't Twitter
throwing admiring glances at some of what he was doing. That all changed.
Yeah, and so
I think Starmer neutralised the big beast in the press. Actually,
I don't think he
neutralised.
Ever did.
Yes, I'm not saying that they were cheering him on with
look
banners.
At them now.
Well, I think it's more subtle than that. I think Sue Gray, wasn't she at one point going to ban, or wasn't there some talk that she wanted to ban MPs of being on Twitter? Because, the papers are obviously responding to what everyone else does on social media, because they can't not do the story once it's become a big story.
Well, yeah, although the
Sunday Times did break this, I think.
And I think it's fair to say that the reaction to the new government, the tone from, say, the Sun, from the Mail, elsewhere, the Telegraph, is so much more vituperative and so much more aggressive than it was, for example, in the late 90s. And as a result, you haven't had that honeymoon that you might have expected. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. One of them actually is about their relationship with Starmer himself, right? We know they never really forgave Starmer, certainly in the News International world, right, for his role in terms of what happened with Leveson, press hacking, being the director of public prosecutions who went after some of those prosecutions with phone hacking. Never forgave him for that. And also I think something is different with the papers, right? The papers, as opposed to in the late 90s, when they still had readerships of Sun and the Mail, in the millions, big national press institutions, They had a very varied readership. They had lots of very centrist voters. These days, you're probably either quite partisan or certainly of a particular type of voter if you're still reading a newspaper. We talk about how the parties' coalitions have narrowed. The papers, the media coalitions have narrowed. It's made their sort of readership more polarised, and so they are more vituperative. They chase after more sort of online clickbait type stuff, and they basically take their lead, like you say.
I don't think you can call this clickbait.
Well, not clickbait.
I mean, I think it has gone beyond that because, and I just want to get back to that question, which I still think is behind this, which is about values politics. And something weird has happened in the sort of social media age, which is, you know, when you see, for example, the George Floyd protest riots, every single company has to decide, you know, how are they responding? Is lack of response, you know, a sort of an aberration? Are you racist if you don't? And I think we've got into this place where, you know, a confident government would either say, you know what, get over yourselves. A bit like Cleverly's done. I am going to take freebies, get over it, that's fine. Or else they'd say, oh my God, you found me out, that was a mistake, and pay it back, you know, within 48 hours. Whereas because we're in this new framing of things where it's about values, it's all, we didn't think you were like that, Keir. We knew they were like that, but we didn't think you were like that. We thought you were different. We thought you were cleaner. We're embellishing this whole question with a sense of, you know, it's almost like parental disappointment on top of it, isn't it?
I mean, I think the paradox that sort of strikes me so much, and Lewis, you talk about kind of what it was like in the transition at 97. It wasn't long after Tony Blair became Prime Minister that it emerges that he'd taken a massive donation from Bernie Ecclestone, who was the head of Formula One.
Yeah, that was his first big scandal.
In return for not banning tobacco advertising on Formula One cars.
Exactly.
It was corruption.
Yeah.
And Tony Blair goes on the record, does an interview with John Humphreys.
Straight kind of guy.
I'm a pretty straight kind of guy. And you then go spin forward to today when Keir Starmer hasn't done anything corrupt. He's played by the rules. And yet he's not walking free in the way that Tony Blair walked free after he said, oh, yeah, look, it was just nothing very much. I'm a pretty straight kind of guy. And he got away with it then. It didn't become a huge... I mean, you know, was he tarnished by it?
Do you remember when we sat here doing a Q&A and one of our listeners said, what do you think will be the first scandal? And I think it was you said, with the Tories it's always sex and with Labour it's always money.
Yeah. That's the old
it's kind
truism.
Of there we are, right?
That's the old truism. And I just think that this is... you are letting this go on and on and on and not nipping it fast and furiously.
But what is nipping? Does nipping mean hand it all back, shut it all down?
Nipping is either...
Or nipping says shut up and go away?
Either. Nipping is either. Nipping is not giving a bit and then saying, but for Angela Rayner, her disco weekend in Ibiza is maybe fine.
And imagine how pissed off they are, by the way.
Completely.
I mean, you know, if you're in the cabinet now and you're Angela Rayner or whoever
the guns are going.
You have been absolutely
hung out to dry.
Because now the question is for you, well, the Prime Minister's given the money back.
Yeah, you're the deputy.
Why is that good enough? Is the Prime Minister operating on a higher moral plane than you? So just in terms of raw politics, it is just highly problematic. I mean, there's only a few other explanations for this, right? Either there is something, particularly with regards to Lord Ali, that is yet to emerge.
There's something else coming.
There's something else coming, which there could be. You know, we're saying we don't know, and there could be, and that is what Downing Street are kind of trying to calibrate and trying to work out. That could be the explanation. If it is not that, and it is just pure kind of political
Well, I think it is related to the latest round of you know, online updates.
Can I just read you something that was sent to me by a friend who has donated money to Labour? I think it comes down to two things. One, is it an office or a personal expense? I would say it's an office expense because the costs of looking good is only incurred because of the job. It's thus like a donor giving them money for office staff, taxes or whatever. Two, are the donors buying influence and political favours to help their business in return? I would say in this case, absolutely not. Wahid Ali is part of the campaign team already a lord. His business interests have nothing to do with the government. He just wants to see Labour win and has worked with that aim for 25 years.
This comes back to the first question, which is, do you bend to perception? Right? Because we always ask that question as journalists. Oh, it's not the thing, it's the look of the thing. I'm not sure how comfortable we should be with that, because that is how politicians act in a 24-hour media race. It's the look of the thing. So do we think that is right? Is that accepting that public will has an input in this?
But in a way, if you're responding to that, then in a way it's a sign
You've
already
lost.
failed.
You've lost.
Right? You've failed already because you failed to provide an adequate explanation or neutralise.
You've lost your
And like I
narrative.
say, this can either be about there's something we don't know that is yet to emerge that Downing Street are kind of scrambling around or yet to reveal. If it's not that, then basically, in a way, well, it's not worse, but it's worse in another sense, which is if it's not that, then it really is about the way they've handled it, competence, in which case that needs to be addressed. And there is a world, if you talk to Labour MPs, they say, look, we've got to remember this, we are still so early on in this government. This was one of the things about the Tories this week. They're all skipping around, sipping the champagne, thinking, oh, Labour screwed it up already, whatever. These are very, very early days. That can be illusory. If there is a world where if Starmer, who is pretty ruthless as we know, looks at this and goes, we have absolutely screwed this up here, something is not working, I need to address it, we need to address it, we need a reorganisation about which there are already lots of rumours, then actually this can be a pivot point where the operation gets better and in the long term everything works out for the best. But if they don't, and we see this continues, they keep bringing that water pistol to this knife fight, which is this modern media environment, they will lose again and again and again, particularly if you don't have the exciting policy agenda, which we've talked about before, to fill that space, which right now, before the budget, they don't have.
It's kind of funny, with only a month to go to the election, which we thought 6 months ago, 9 months ago, would be dominated by Trump's legal problems.
Yeah.
It hasn't been an issue that has come up. And yet last night, a judge ordered the unsealing of a document, and that's something we don't really get in the UK. But the judge said, I want to see the evidence of the special prosecutor, Jack Smith, that you have about Donald Trump on January the 6th and what your case is against him. And it has been duly published, which kind of puts Donald Trump again in an unflattering light over some of his antics and actions that led up to the riots of January the 6th.
And this all hinges round the ruling that the Supreme Court made a few months ago, which said that Donald Trump would be immune from prosecution because actions taken whilst he was in office could be seen to be part of the office of the presidency. And yesterday, prosecutors in court alleged that these documents show the former president is not immune from prosecution. The words they use is Donald Trump resorted to crimes in his attempt to overturn his 2020 election defeat. And at the heart of the argument, I guess, is this question of whether he was acting in the office of president when he was fighting to essentially overturn the election results, or whether he was doing it in a personal capacity. And the Supreme Court ruling says, yes, you have immunity if that is part of your action as president. And the special counsel is trying to argue that no, this was done in a personal capacity by a man who had lost.
He was a private citizen who was running for election, like anyone else in the country. And therefore, you could not say it was in the nation's interests. It was Donald Trump who wanted to win the election. And therefore, he was acting as an individual. And this document, I mean, the legal case against him runs to 165 pages. And it presents the clearest view of what the Smiths team think was what Donald Trump was getting up to. Not just on January the 6th itself, although that in itself is a fascinating read. With Donald Trump apparently sitting in the private dining room at the White House, hearing the crowd baying for Mike Pence's head.
And saying, so what?
And him saying, so what, as the Secret Service move him to an underground bunker for his own protection. So his own vice president is threatened, his life is being threatened, and Donald Trump is apparently saying, so what?
Yeah, and Mike Pence comes into this in another way as well, because this new court filing reveals that Trump ignored the advice of Mike Pence to admit that the 2020 election was over. In other words, Mike Pence comes out of this as the persecuted, literally, they wanted his head, and as the man who had the sense to try and convince Trump to give it all up, and Trump ignored him. And so that was the point at which the prosecutors allege Trump and his associates, interesting word, because they were not part of, as it were, the sort of the civil service or the body within the presidency. They were completely personal associates. They were, the private lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and the sort of hangers-on that did not actually play a proper official role. And the prosecutor says that he hatched a criminal scheme to subvert the peaceful transfer of power. Now, the question, obviously, you're waiting for us to get onto is, documents, 165 pages, we get it. What's it going to do to the race?
I mean, in US politics, you talk about the October surprise, the kind of the shoe that drops that suddenly, everyone gasps.
Yeah.
I don't think this is that. I think, one, it's too early, too far out from the election. And secondly, what's it going to result in? I mean, yeah, sure, it's another day's headlines where January the 6th is back up there in lights. And we saw in the vice presidential debate that we talked about, J.D. Vance's kind of total
hamstrung.
discomfort.
He just cannot answer that question.
About, who won the election. Yeah. And so it, again, focuses on that again. But does it tell us anything much that we didn't already know? There's more detail there, but you'd have to be very, very attentive to think this is going to change the way I vote, and it's not going to result in a prosecution.
Right, we're not going to see a trial. Nothing's going to come to court before the election. After an election, if Donald Trump wins, it's kind of game over. If he doesn't win, I guess the impending doom lessons anyway. I mean, not you still want the rule of law to be enacted, but it's not like it's going to stop anyone in their tracks. And so I guess the question is, does it actually energise this undecided 1%, whatever it is, of the base, who go and fundraise for him, who go and remember that the mugshot's on, the mugs again, and kind of go, oh, this is lawfare, this is the Democrats trying to stop him from being our president again. Does it actually work in the way that so many of these previous cases have been, which is actually to do him a favour? Well,
I mean, the one obvious bit to say about all of this is who didn't want this unsealed? Who wanted to keep this under wraps? Trump's lawyers. Trump's lawyers did not want this to come out. They didn't want the judge to order the unsealing. They argued that it was unconstitutional, that it shouldn't be allowed to happen, that all this is kind of just a way of distracting attention from the election and to help Donald Trump lose. And the judge said, no, I'm sorry, this is fair enough. We are going to unseal these documents. So on that, Trump clearly didn't want any of this to come out because he knows, or his campaign team know, that the more you focus on January the 6th, the more this election becomes about Donald Trump and not about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the more chance there is that Donald Trump loses.
And in a moment, we are taking you to the Chagos Islands, metaphorically.
So, as devoted newsagents listeners, you know that we have our morning editorial meeting where we kick around the ideas of the day and what's going to be the big story. And let's make a frank confession, none of us was speaking about the Chagos Islands this morning.
Fools that we were.
Fools that we were, and probably even less aware of where they were. But now, oh yes, we know all about it.
It's the talk of the town.
One of your many holiday destinations, I assume, over the years?
I have never been to the Chagos Islands. I'd love to go
to
Not yet. But I think a newsagent special from the Chagos Islands on handover to Mauritius would be a great thing.
This is causing a lot of consternation in Conservative politics today, because earlier on, David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, announced that Britain had signed a deal with the government of Mauritius to hand over the Chagos Islands. And this has been like a long-running sore between the UK and Mauritius, but also other countries like India and countries in Africa as well, because this is basically it's one of the last remnants of empire. Mauritius had claimed it. There was a US military base on the island, so we had been reluctant to hand it back, particularly for fear of Chinese influence. But there has been an agreement today with Mauritius saying that Britain will retain the military base, which actually, for all of the chat and consternation about how this will demean or undermine British geopolitical influence or hand it over to the Chinese, Biden's welcomed it today.
Yeah, I mean, you will all now be Googling, what do they talk about? Where is it? Where is it? It is this tiny tropical, dots actually, an atoll, which is sort of collection of them. And Diego Garcia is one of the ones which is actually used by the US government as a military base for its naval ships and I think bomber aircraft, and that will stay obviously under US control. But Mauritius, I think, has long argued that it was forced to give up these islands when it gained independence from us, from the UK, in 1968. And so the deal today is to allow the US to carry on using Diego Garcia as a military base, but for Mauritius to take over the
They will
rest
have
of the...
sovereignty of the
They will
islands.
have sovereignty. And do you know what the people of the Chagos Islands are called?
Chagosians?
Yes, Chagosians. And so I guess the question is, does it hit that same nerve for Conservative politicians as Gibraltar would or the Falklands would? Is it... I mean, we should say,
Hang on, let's make a declaration.
Let's
here.
make a declaration. Let's play by the cards.
Oh, I wonder why you're interested in that.
I'm going to now out Mateless. At the Tory party conference, the three of us get approached by two members of the Falkland Islands Council who say to us, you should come and do the podcast. Mateless's face lights up, writes to our boss and says, we've got to go to the Falklands. So now
Falkland
we are...
Islands live show. So we'll have
Yes.
done Royal Albert Hall and Port Stanley.
Yeah.
Goose Screen
Two
as well.
big ones.
Yeah,
Exactly.
but now I think what we should do
Hello
is a
to everyone
double-head...
listening to us in the Falkland Islands. We know you are manifold.
Say hello
think
to the
what I-
penguins.
I think what we're looking forward to, it's John in the Chagos Islands. It's Emily
I'll take
at Port
Chagos.
Stanley.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And, it will be a small outside broadcast. Expenses very limited.
Just a little bit here. Is this going to blow up? Is this going to become the next thing that the Labour government has got terribly wrong because the Tories think that they've given away sovereignty of our blessed land? Or is it going to be something that actually goes away as quickly as it
This
came?
has been going on for decades. And I think there have been 11 rounds of negotiations, actually with the previous government. Two
But there is a
under
handover.
this.
I'm really good at handovers. I did the Hong Kong handover.
Yes.
I did the Macau handover.
I don't think it has quite the geopolitical strategic importance of the handover of Hong Kong.
Well, I don't know. There are lots of... No,
Early
not as
to
much,
say.
but it's kind of like, there's no doubt that look, lots of Conservatives are getting very worked up about this. James Cleverly is getting very worked up about this, despite the fact that actually a deal was almost reached under the previous government. And they are all raising the spectre of what happens to Gibraltar and the Falklands, of course, without actually confronting the reality that as a result of long-term defence cuts, right? If Argentina invaded the Falklands today, would we be able to defend it? Probably not. So, in a way, this is a recognition of some geopolitical reality. And clearly it will have some sort of symbolic resonance on the right. But as I say, given that the US administration have welcomed the deal and they're the ones who primarily use the base and want to counter potential Chinese influence in the region, and the fact that, ultimately this has become a running sore at the UN with country after country, particularly in Africa and India and so on, saying, well, look, Britain has been found to have breached international law on this in refusing to hand it back over because various international arbitration efforts had said that Britain illegally took it and should hand it back over to Mauritius. Sometimes you have to, and I wonder whether this is part of Starmer's calculation as a lawyer, as he is, sometimes you have to practice what you preach. If that is what international law says, if we are preaching to Russia and elsewhere and China, they should do the same, then we should do it. And actually, I'm just reading now that not only is this becoming a source of Conservative to Labour political attacks, but it's actually become a source of contention within the Conservative leadership race itself. So Tom Tugendhat, campaign source, is briefing that, quotes, Labour's decision to push forward the deal negotiated by James Cleverly as Foreign Secretary to give up the Chagos Islands has raised questions about the government's commitment to the Falkland Islands. The Falkland Islands are British, no debate, full stop. Tom won't trade away sovereignty. So there you have Tugendhat basically using this to attack Cleverly, because as I say, he was Foreign Secretary then. So it's an odd story in a sense. It seems like an esoteric one, but it is, for various reasons, really animating the right of politics.
We'll be back.
We'll be back.
From Port Stanley.
Bye-bye.
Next week.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.